Hey everyone, welcome. Pastor Patrick Walker. We are in Genesis chapter 42. It's a beautiful morning. I've got roosters right outside my office, so if you hear one or two of them crowing, that's what it is. But we are in Genesis 42. We'll finish that chapter and we'll move on. It's a story that all blends together. So maybe we can cover several chapters here. Here's where we're at. Joseph essentially allows his brothers to load up grain, but he secretly returns their money in their sacks. And as they leave Egypt and they camp for the first night and they begin to feed their animals, they realize, oh my gosh, the silver that we had brought to pay for the grain has been returned to us. So they're scared. This is in verse 28, Genesis 42:28. Their hearts sank and they turned to each other trembling and said, what is this that God has done to us? They didn't understand. Now they go back and they report to their father what had happened. Basically, they had a confrontation with the one who was the Lord of the land of Egypt. He thought we were spies. He asked about our family. And we didn't know what he was getting at, so we were just trying to answer him honestly. And essentially, he said, well, you guys are spies, and unless you prove it, I am going to keep one of your brothers imprisoned in Egypt until you bring your younger brother to me as proof that what you were saying was true. So Jacob hears the story. He says, there's no way I am sending Benjamin, my favorite son, back down to Egypt. There's no way, because if I lose him, I'll be finished. I've already lost Joseph. If I lose Benjamin, I'm finished. Now, chapter 43, the famine is so severe that they run out of food. So Judah comes to his father and says, we've got to go back down. It would be my life for his life. If anything happens to Benjamin, I will pay for it in my own life, and my children. Let the judgment fall upon my own head. I will vouch for the child. I'll protect him. So Judah eventually realizes that there's no other way, there's no other means of salvation because the famine is so severe. So he allows Benjamin to go with the 9 other brothers. Remember, one of the 10th one is still in prison in Egypt. And he says, okay, take twice as much silver. This is verse 11. Take extra gifts to pay for your mistake. And may God grant you mercy. Verse 14. So they take the gifts, double the amount of silver. Verse 15. And Benjamin, and they go. Now when they arrive, Joseph has them separate, says, hey, take them to my house. So they go to Joseph's house and they're afraid because they have no idea what's going on. They don't know if they're going to get ambushed. They don't know if they're in particular special trouble. They ask the servants and, hey, can you tell us what's going on? They're scared, they're fearful. And the servant says in verse 23 of chapter 43:23, it is all right. Don't be afraid. Your God, the God of your father, has given you treasure in your sacks. I received your silver. So if the silver was received, but it was returned, it doesn't make sense. They're confused. They wash up, feed the animals. Joseph comes in at noon for lunch, and he doesn't eat he feeds them and he eats separately. And he gives Benjamin a portion that's 5 times as much as anyone else. It's verse 34. I told you we're just going to fly through this because I want to get to a couple major points here in chapter 44 and beyond. Now, Joseph says, okay, fill everybody's sack, but put each man's silver back in the sack again, and take my special cup, like my silver cup that I drink from, and put it in Benjamin's sack. So he's going to set them up. And they leave and they go back to the father. They're headed back. Now he sends the armed guard out, says, hey, one of you guys stole Joseph's, they didn't call him Joseph, but the Lord's, the Lord of Egypt's cup. And they said, no, we would never do that. We wouldn't even think about doing something like that. And so they said, you're welcome to search our bags. And I want to highlight 2 verses. Verse 5, Isn't this the cup my master drinks from and also uses for divination? This is a wicked thing that you have done. He's accusing him. He said, no, you shouldn't say that of us. If you find anyone who has the cup, we're confident we don't have it. If you find it, they can die. And we'll all become your slaves. So a search takes place from the oldest to the youngest. And of course, the cup is found in Benjamin's sack. At this, they tore their clothes, and they all loaded their donkeys and returned back to the city. And they threw themselves, verse 14 of Genesis 44, at the feet of Joseph. And Joseph said, what is this that you have done? Don't you know that a man like me can find out things by divination? And they say, how can we prove our innocence? We really, truly didn't do this. We'll become your slaves. Please, please, please. And Judah's going to step forward and say, I vouch for this boy. You've got to let him go. Take me instead. And that's a very honorable, noble thing to do. And that is one test where Joseph is discerning the heart of his brothers. But talking about verse 5 and verse 15, where Joseph mentions this cup being used for divination. So, obviously we know at the time of Moses, Pharaoh had magicians, enchanters, sorcerers. They could replicate some of the miracles that Moses could do. So they had supernatural spiritual power to a degree because of demonic, forces. But Joseph's mention of this, basically he says, don't you know that I can find out things by my secret arts? I won't even call them dark arts because I don't know how much Joseph was involved, but they definitely had the capabilities in Egypt of doing this based upon the connections with multiple demonic figures. And I would think of it like this. If a demon exists in the spiritual realm and you have a hierarchy, so you have a bunch of demons, you're consulting with a high-powered demon who has many underlings. And so in the heavenly realms, imagine like an overview perspective of what's going on the earth. The demons are observing. If you got thousands of demons all throughout the land of Egypt, they're seeing what's taking place. They're in the presence of this interaction between Joseph and his brothers. So basically what he's saying is, I can tap into the spiritual realm and talk to the demonic realm about what they saw and get information, supernatural information based upon spiritual observation. And I believe that's, of course, we see it in the Bible in multiple cases. And so I certainly believe that is true. But the flip side of that is, if demons have limited understanding and knowledge and insight, because they're seeing it, they're watching people, they're involved in human affairs. So they know a lot more than we know from our limited perspective. But who is it that knows everything? It's God. So I believe that we're in an era where if the church isn't able to compete with what the world is able to offer, with the mediums and the palm readers and the spiritualists of the world are able to offer, we will become irrelevant. We will become like Pharisees, like just the church of Jesus' day that was just going through the motions. It was religious, but it had the power and presence of God was absent. So my heart in reading this is that if the enemy can access spiritual knowledge and wisdom, think about the spiritual gifts, wisdom, knowledge, prophecy. If the enemy can mimic this to a degree, how much more should the church be able to supersede anything that the enemy could come up with? Again, Moses and his encounter with the magicians of Egypt, they could replicate water into blood. They threw their staffs on the ground, they turned into snakes. But in each and every situation, Moses' power that was operating through the one true God was superior to any of the demonic power that was manifested through the magicians. So again, I would, wouldn't it be amazing if people, when they needed wisdom, when they needed knowledge, when they needed to make a decision, they could come to the church, and Christians were known as the wisest people on the earth. and as those who could get an answer from God about what should be done in each and every situation, because they were so close. It's just like you think about the prophets in the Old Testament where Elijah, he is hearing in his prayer time, he's hearing the enemy's plans. And he's sending, imagine for us, for China or Ukraine and Russia. He's in Ukraine and he's hearing the plans, the Russian plans in their headquarters, and he's sending the information to the generals of Ukraine to say, hey, be careful. This is what they're planning next. This is what's going to happen tonight. So they're able to position themselves in a way that they can successfully thwart everything the enemy throws against them, because they got this prophet who's hearing supernatural words of wisdom in his prayer time. So, of course, this excites me, because if this is possible for the enemy, it should be much more possible for the Lord. What does it take to grow so close to him and to abide so deeply with such intimacy with Christ that we pursue that oneness so that we can truly be a channel of God's blessing to other people, the church and unbelievers, because we're able to speak God's will and God's wisdom to those around us. So I love that. All right. He keeps going. One more point. Basically, Judah comes and says, hey, take my life for the life of Benjamin. And it's at this point, Joseph could no longer control himself. This is chapter 45. He goes out, he weeps, he comes back in, and then he reveals himself. And he says, I am Joseph. And they are terrified. This is verse 3. They didn't know what to say. They were so confused. Because remember, he's been speaking Egyptian this whole time through an interpreter, and now he switches to Hebrew, and he's talking to them in their own language, and he obviously knows them. And they're absolutely amazed. And Joseph says in verse 5, he says, and now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourself. So we can still have guilt. I mean, we can be slaves of guilt and shame from things many, many years ago. And unless we deal with those things, we can never be free. We can never be healthy. But he's going to give the purpose. And we know that Romans chapter 8, verse 28 says that we know in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And we see that displayed in Joseph's life. Over a 20-year period of heartache and trial and difficulties, both sides are suffering. We see God working through all of it to bring about his purpose and plan. And this is an amazing example of Romans 8:28. So he says there's going to be famine for the next 5 years. You go back, tell my dad that I'm still alive. You all come and live in the land of Egypt, because God, what Satan has attempted to do for harm, God has brought about healing and deliverance. And they go back and they share with Jacob, their father, that Joseph is still alive. And he decides to move down to Egypt. Okay. And I think that closes out chapter 45. One last thing I'll say is secrets are toxic. And I don't know this for certain because we don't have this in the text, but to hold a secret is a burden, And I think there's freedom from confession. And he's like, well, how is Joseph alive? Jacob's like, how is Joseph alive if he died by the wild animal? I don't know if the boys would have said, Father, we lied to you. We deceived you. We did this, if they confessed. I would like to think that they did that, because only through confession would they find freedom and healing. Because secrets, I think, can rob you of health, as that guilt, that shame, that sin, unconfessed sin just eats at you. And it's been doing this for 22 years up to this point. So I like to think that they came clean. They told their father what they had truly done, and all was forgiven, just as Joseph was willing to forgive them for all the evil that they had intended, because he could see how God used it for good. I believe that Jacob was willing to forgive the boys when sin was confessed, and we have a restart. We have a transformative moment where the past is wiped away and we're able to start fresh again in this season as they go to Egypt. So this is a wonderful conclusion to essentially the story. We're going to see a little bit more because there's a few more chapters, but just wanted to talk about divination and the ability of Christians to far surpass whatever the enemy can do if they pursue intimacy with God, to help people find freedom through forgiveness and dealing with the past, and also discern the will of the Lord for their particular lives. All right. So lot to consider, a lot of reading. I just skimmed through it. Go back, read those chapters, and we'll pick up on chapter 46 next time we meet. Okay. God bless.